This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Breaking the Impasse, Electoral Politics, Mass Action, and the New Socialist Movement in the United States by Kim Moody. In his latest book, veteran socialist writer Kim Moody provides a masterful analysis of the political impasse which has shaped the rise of a new socialist movement in the U.S. Sharp inequality, state violence, climate catastrophe, and a globally ascendant right proceed apace while the U.S. political arena remains defined and dominated by two capitalist political parties. Moody situates the historic electoral campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, along with the growth of organizations like DSA, in this context, and incisively assesses the revived movement's focus on electoral strategies, ultimately arguing for an alternative orientation based in a politics of mass action, anti-racism, and independent working-class organizing. Breaking the Impasse by Kim Moody, out now from Haymarket Books and available at haymarketbooks.org, where U.S. and U.K. readers receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £25, respectively. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Today's interview is with four comrades who are organizers and leaders in the American Tenant movement: Shanti Singh, Tracy Rosenthal, Renee Moya, and Sia Weaver. This is a really important conversation because the places where people live and the relationships of economic domination that define the home are critical sites for organizing, parallel to the sort of organizing that must be done in the places where people work and the relationships of economic domination that define labor. As the contradictions of real estate capitalism intensify and the housing crisis becomes more generalized, those organizing opportunities to build tenant power and decommodify the housing system are growing. This is also what I've recently been dedicating much of my own organizing work in Rhode Island to. And just this week, Pioneer Tenants United, a tenant union supported by my organization Reclaim RI, has reached a crisis point. Slumlord Pioneer Investments has issued retaliatory evictions and terminations of tenancy against at least 5 Pioneer households for speaking out against horrific and dangerous conditions pervasive across this slumlord's 60-plus buildings in the state. Pioneer tenants have been living with rats, bugs, mold, leaks, lack of heat and hot water, raw sewage, and, most dangerously, lead paint that has poisoned children. And so instead of asking you to support The Dig at Patreon this week, I'm asking you to contribute, and to contribute generously, to the Pioneer Tenant Support Fund. Our goal is to raise $50,000 over the next few weeks, enough to cover each impacted household's first month's rent and security deposit in case they need to move, with some left over in the quite possible case that more tenants are hit with evictions. I've posted a link to the support fund in the show notes. This is a daunting sum for us to raise, but it's absolutely critical to our campaign and to the future of tenant organizing in Rhode Island that we reach our goal. Please help out. Pioneer's retaliation is a clear violation of Rhode Island law, which bars landlords from seeking to remove tenants from their homes in retaliation for complaining to government officials or to the landlord about code violations, or because, quote, the tenant has organized or become a member of a tenants union or similar organization. Right now, Reclaim and impacted Pioneer tenants are aggressively pursuing legal remedies. But to our knowledge, this will be the first time ever that tenants' legal right to organize has been tested in Rhode Island court, at least in memory. That's because Pioneer Tenants United is the most aggressive and broad-based attack on a slumlord in Rhode Island in memory. And that's why I need you to support Pioneer Tenants United. This is not about charity. This is about solidarity. This is mutual aid to support tenant leaders who have taken on an enormous risk on behalf of the entire nascent tenant movement in Rhode Island. Pioneer Investments is trying to break our union by forcing these tenants from their homes. We must ensure that this is not a defeat. We must instead make sure that this is the first major tenant victory against a Rhode Island slumlord. A victory that will lay the groundwork for a mass movement of tenants in my state that will put an end to slumlord exploitation and abuse and build the political power that we need to win social housing. Again, I've posted a link to the Pioneer Tenant Support Fund in the show notes. Please give generously and please circulate this call for solidarity far and wide. We're aiming to raise $50,000. That is a ton of money. It's a really, truly daunting sum. Please give what you can. And if you can give big, please do. This is a make or break moment for a historic tenant organizing campaign that will help decide the future of the tenant movement in Rhode Island. I'll return to asking you to support this podcast next week. Please support Pioneer Tenants United now. Okay, here's my interview with Shanti Singh, Tracy Rosenthal, Renee Moya, and Sia Weaver. Shanti Singh is the Legislative and Communications Director at Tenants Together, a California coalition of over 50 tenant unions and housing justice organizations. Outside of work, she organizes with DSA and San Francisco tenants around social housing, tenant protections, community land trusts, public banking, rent control, and more. Tracy Rosenthal is a writer and co-founder of the LA Tenants Union. Their book, Abolish Rent, written with their mentor Leonardo Vilchis, is forthcoming from Verso. Renee Christian Moya is the Tenant Power Coordinator with the Debt Collective and an organizer with the Los Angeles Tenants Union. He's the former campaign director for a statewide ballot initiative to strengthen rent control in California, and has worked extensively on tenant rights, homelessness, pandemic-era emergency legislation, and social housing. Sia Weaver is the coordinator of Housing Justice for All, a statewide coalition of grassroots organizations fighting to build tenant power and end homelessness in New York State. She has worked as a tenant organizer, campaigner, and housing policy advocate in New York State for over 10 years and is from Rochester, New York. Oh, and one quick note before we get started, you will hear people refer to LATU and ATUN. LATU is the LA Tenants Union, ATUN is the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. Shanti Singh, Tracy Rosenthal, Renee Moya, and Sia Weaver, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, hi, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To get us started, can you quickly say your name, the organizations that you're a part of, and what sort of campaigns or priorities you and others are currently waging or working on?
I can just start. My name is Renee Moya. I am an organizer with the Debt Collective, which is the nation's first debtors union, and also a member organizer with the Los Angeles Tenants Union here in Southern California. In terms of campaigns that we're waging, I think it really does kind of span the gamut of campaigns from efforts around social housing at the state and federal level, as well as an ongoing set of projects always around tenant protections and individual campaigns to keep tenants in their homes. I think that is roughly where we're at the moment.
I'm Shanti Singh. I am the Comms and Legislative Director at Tenants Together. We are a 50-plus group statewide coalition in California of mostly tenant unions, but other housing justice organizations as well across the state. That's my day job. Outside of my day job, have done a lot of housing work in San Francisco and the Bay Area, which is where I live, particularly around social housing, land use, public banking, tenant organizing, all of those wonderful things, community land trusts. And so I have a extracurricular life too, but a lot of that also, especially rent control and social housing, are issues that I work on in my day job.
Tracy?
Hey, I'm Tracy Rosenthal. I helped start the LA Tenants Union in 2015. And recently I've been spending more time in New York, where I'm helping start an organizing effort in Flatbush And also, I'm organizing my own building, and today we're celebrating our 5th month of rent strike. So that's really exciting. I think just like, looking at, I'm in LA, I'm back in LA now, working with my mentor on our book. And it's interesting to really see the stages of organizations the stage of organization that we're at, and thinking about the work that we're doing in New York, really just that spade work of door knocking and bringing people out, and then to be here and see the union in what, one of my comrades referred to as a process of refounding, which is, seeing the organization really get taken over by its base members and reestablished its meeting structures in the different locals. That's really rooted in the communities that it's in. So I'm having this really double experience of organizing right now.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Sia, and I run Housing Justice for All, which is a statewide coalition of grassroots tenant organizations across New York that represent tenants and homeless New Yorkers. We are really working to build tenant power that is capable of challenging the role that the real estate industry plays in Albany. So we support the growth of tenant unions all over New York State. We support working with those tenant unions and bringing them together to craft a policy agenda and then campaign for it in our state house. I have been doing tenant organizing in New York State for a little over 10 years. And in that time, I worked to help co-found the Crown Heights Tenant Union. I've worked with tenants who have wanted to take over their buildings and convert them into limited equity cooperatives. And now I'm in this role of forming and growing the statewide coalition of tenant unions, tenant associations, and organizations that represent homeless New Yorkers to win political power in Albany.
My organization was founded in early 2020, and we redirected our focus toward housing in late 2021 because it was a strategic choice we made, because it became clear that housing was the concrete issue people were facing in huge numbers and in a really dire way. And so there was both a major organizing need and also a major organizing opportunity there. But you all have been working on housing and tenant organizing a lot longer than that. How has the housing crisis becoming this more generalized crisis in recent years changed the terrain of struggle?
I mean, I can start by saying, what's different. I mean, there's always been a housing crisis for especially low-income folks, but for the working class in general. But I think that there's a lot more interest and attention in the at least 8 years that I've been doing this, because it's impacting more and more people, right? Because it's sort of impacting people at a sort of higher levels of income, higher levels in the working class. And so I think that particular, I mean, this has been an issue definitely post 2008 in general, and that's when Tenants Together, where I work, was founded, was in the aftermath of 2008. But I think we've noticed that shift. I mean, I think that's just a broader social shift in terms of the sort of background around the work that everybody's doing.
Renee?
Yeah, I would just say that, I've been organizing, in and around the issues of homelessness and housing for, at this point, about 12 to 14 years, with the emphasis kind of going between homelessness and housing, I think in different stages of my life, kind of changing up as the terrain has changed. But I think one of the kind of interesting things about that organizing is that initially when I started organizing on issues of housing during the financial crisis, it was very much a crisis that was focused around homeowners on both sides of the Atlantic, right? I was at the time in the UK. By the time I moved back to the US, I was basically still organizing into that breach where folks had, lost their homes, while at the same time, I was also organizing around homelessness issues. I think it was until roughly the middle of the 2010s or 20-teens that I started organizing directly around tenant issues. And it's for precisely the same reasons that I think Shanti has kind of laid out, right? The idea that class composition, if you will, of the folks who were being affected by the housing crisis had definitely shifted. There were folks who were more on the upper end of the middle class who were starting to feel that pinch, that crisis. But there was also, I think, the other kind of analytical side of it, right? The fact that any of us who have been organizing around housing had, very much came to realize that rental housing was the next stage of the crisis, or another area in which capital and capitalists, frankly, were basically shifting or changing what our, the nature of tenure and how people's lives were being affected by housing. I think it was almost an inevitable sort of move into tenant organizing specifically, and being able to recognize how whenever we talked about things like gentrification, we could no longer just, talk about how, foreclosures had moved out entire populations from poor or working class communities, how to deal with that issue, to deal with that crisis, we really had to grapple with the situation of tenants on the ground. And so I think that over the long durée, I think has been the big shift for me, at least personally.
Yeah, I think I'd just echo what you both are saying in terms of understanding a crisis as something that has always affected the poor that suddenly affects the middle and upper middle class, right? That's the kind of media, that's when something arrives in the media as crisis. I mean, I think it's really important to think about for me, when I started, the problem that we heard was gentrification, right? The displacement and replacement of the poor for profit. And that is really what we founded the union to beat back, and the state of just the control of real estate over the lives of the poor and working class people in the places where we lived. But I think now when I think of what is the stage of terrain that we're at, I feel like part of it is as more unhoused people are, joining our local chapters, and from experiences that I've had organizing, I mean, what I'm really seeing is the stepped up policing apparatus, where now we have a shelter system that's presented as humanitarian aid, presented as housing, but it's really more like a combination of housing and jail. And we have a new kinds of legal apparatus where legal categories are invented, like participants in programs, to basically automate these kinds of violence that the state is waging on people without housing, without indoor housing. And I think that this is kind of the terrain that we're in right now, that, it's thinking about cities as this engine of and repository for an immense amount of wealth, and the way that the repressive forces of the state are really gearing up to defend and intensify that. I mean, I think that that's I feel like that's happening in ways that we are not quite prepared for, but that we really should be.
Sia.
I'm tenant organizing in New York, all over New York State, and working with tenant organizers all over New York State. And I think it's important to sort of situate the work that we're doing today in a long, long history of tenant struggle in New York. So we've had some form of rent control in New York State since the 1920s, and we also have had for many, many years an incredibly powerful real estate industry that is using valuable land in New York City, but really across the state, to speculate and generate an immense amount of wealth. And so I really think about our state's sort of rent control laws and the general terrain of tenant organizing as competing, basically that the state is a terrain on which real estate is fighting, and so are tenants. And in recent years, I mean, the sort of shape of the New York State housing movement has shifted quite a bit. I think for quite a long time, the housing movement, the housing movement started our sort of current iteration in the last 100 years. It really starts with socialists organizing for rent control in New York City, immense housing shortages and poor living conditions. And over the years, it shifted to become a lot more professionalized. And I think our sort of current iteration of the housing movement relies way too much on community development corporations and these sort of 501c3 nonprofits that took over a lot of housing in New York in the 1970s and the 1980s after a period of divestment. For a long time, that was what characterized the housing movement in New York. That is shifting. There is a lot more grassroots tenant activity, and there is a lot more people organizing directly in their buildings for things like rent control than had happened recently. And I think we're sort of also seeing in recent years, in addition to the things that everyone else has said about a rise of more people feeling the crunch all over the state and the country, we're also seeing an immense amount of small landlord backlash here to a growing tenant movement. So I think it's always been true that the landlords have been in power, but after, 2 years of various forms of eviction moratoria across the country, we are certainly seeing landlords getting a lot more bold and gross with how they attempt to wield their political power.
On the left, we think a lot about workers and the working class, including the leverage of workers in particular sectors. So what sort of social grouping are tenants? And what's your assessment of their place in the political economic order and then their role in transforming it? Is it a form of working class organizing basically comparable or parallel to labor organizing the same people off the shop floor in the domain of social reproduction rather than production, or something different going on?
In Law 2, we define tenant as someone who doesn't have control over their housing. And another way of looking at that is as someone who inhabits but doesn't own property, right? And someone who doesn't own property in a country whose electoral system was built on trying to keep the threat of the property list at bay. And in our economic system that is increasingly based on property ownership as the sole means of any kind of financial security, as the social wage is being withdrawn. And so for me, right, that's what a tenant is. And the role of the tenant, I think of as, I think at this point, the statistic is maybe 4 years old, but I think I remember 60% of the world's wealth is held in real estate and 75% of that is in housing. So for me, and I think a lot of the thinking behind the tenants union, right, is that the role of the tenant is to expropriate and redistribute that hoarded wealth. And more than that, right, it's to democratize the control over the spaces where we live. So if a tenant is someone who doesn't control their own housing, then a tenants union is supposed to not make that a condition without dignity or stability.
Yeah, I agree with Tracy. And that's also, not just where I work, but also, even in, say, DSA, because I'm pretty active in DSA, and some of us here are too. That's kind of how we would define tenant as well. And in my experience, I think that's a pretty shared definition. It is, you can be a housed tenant, you can be an unhoused tenant, you can be if you're a victim of foreclosure, like you were in the 2008 crisis, if you're a squatter, those are all different forms of tenancy. And I think that also, that doesn't just speak to sort of what's happening in America, that also speaks to sort of what the global housing crisis looks like in all its different forms. But yeah, I would also say, I think a lot of folks that I work with definitely, a union at work, a union at home is kind of a slogan that we like to use a lot, or, up with wages, down with rents. So I do think that it is kind of working in tandem with the labor movement. It's the idea of just, your home, just like your workplace, is another side of struggle.
Sia, Renee?
Yeah, I think that's something that we should include in this conversation is how real estate ownership is getting a lot more concentrated over the last 10 and 20 years, really coming off of the foreclosure crisis, but that's a trend that's been growing. And so similarly, I think to sort of labor organizing in its heyday, you're looking for sort of hoarders of wealth. That's a very good way to describe it. the real estate industry, the more consolidated it gets, the more the conditions for tenant organizing as something, and tenant union formation as something that is really comparable historically to the role of the labor movement, and labor movement formation is increasingly, I think, possible and critical. Though I do think we need to think about what are some of the shortcomings of the labor movement and the ways in which people who are not working in consolidated industries have not been able to benefit from labor unions, and how we can think about different ways in which tenant unions can provide, that same sort of solidarity and collective activity and dignity at home to people who have small landlords. We don't really want to only think about tenant organizing for people who live in buildings that are owned by corporate landlords or even mid-sized landlords. This is really critical that the power relationships between tenants and landlords, period, are bad, and we need to have some formation that is capable of addressing that everywhere that it exists.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has already said quite a bit of the stuff that I would have said. I would add a couple of things. Number one is that I think there's been a methodologically interesting, but practically useless debate on the left for, 40, 50 years around, housing tenure and class, basically, right? On the question of, for example, is a tenant essentially the working class? Or if you're a homeowner, are you not, or are you no longer the working class? I think that kind of debate around, what homeownership is in relation to class, while again, I think interesting in some capacity, is not necessarily one that one can organize around, or one that is frankly fairly that interesting or practical for organizing. So I think that in a way we have to start from a practical definition of what the tenant is and what tenants as a mass are. And to me, they are coterminous, even if analytically they are different, very different categories of analysis. And so when we talk about, organizing tenants, in my head, I think about us actually organizing the working class where they are, right? I think Sia has very eloquently, I think, talked already about the differences or the shift in work and in how labor unions have to organize workers at the site of struggle. That too has shifted with respect to one's community, right? It has shifted into not just the community at large, but also even how one relates to one's housing has shifted over time. So I think that those are things I think that we always have to be very keen and clear-eyed about. And in terms of just generally the when we, how we organize tenants, I do also think that for folks who are organizing, let's say the undocumented, folks who are organizing people of color, that struggle also shifts with housing, right? There are obviously these issues around one's documented status at work as well, very clearly so. And of course, as we all know, very, famously, the AFL-CIO and labor unions for a long time wrestled with the notion of the undocumented as members of the working class who were deserving of being organized, right, into these spaces. I think tenant organizing has always been much more accepting of those realities, right, of what the working poor actually looks like on the ground. Final thing I'd add is that I think what is interesting about the struggle around tenants' rights right now is that while tenants are a minority of the population of this country, it is also a growing share of the population. It has mostly been concentrated in our major cities, even though that is, again, shifting. And in major states like, New York and California, the larger states, possibly even in places like Texas, that share of tenants vis-a-vis homeowners is shifting in the direction of tenants. And that, though, is not entirely being reproduced in other states where homeowners are overwhelmingly the largest share, both of the general population, but also, we should frankly state it, also of the working class, right? And so I think being cognizant, very, I think, aware about those differences, I think matters. We should couch it in a broader analysis of what cities, the role that our cities play in capitalism in the 21st century, and how that is only shifting with time. I think that the condition of the tenant is something that more and more Americans and more American working class folks, frankly, in the developed world generally, are going to have to confront, right, in the next, I would say, 20 to 30 years. This is something that is only going to become a condition, an experience that more and more folks outside of our major cities experience as well.
Renee, you bring up some important points. Most of you are organizing in big American cities, or maybe all of you on this call, California and New York. But of course, tenant unions are also sprouting up in smaller, medium-sized American cities, Omaha, Phoenix, Kansas City, here in Providence, Rhode Island, or Rhode Island generally. But it does seem like tenant organizing and tenant unions are most common in places that are denser and where there's a larger cross-section of the working class renting rather than homeowning. So excluding people saddled with long-term mortgages, I think Tracy, you cited this, it's about 35% of the country that rents. And obviously, we can't speak to what the conditions are everywhere in the country amongst just with the 4 or 5 of us here. But I'm curious what you all think or have observed about the geographical variations or patterns in the tenant movement across the United States. How does it differ or vary from place to place in terms of the nature of who the tenants are, what protections are on offer, and simply who is a tenant and to what extent does tenancy coincide with the broader condition of the working class in whatever place, and then just what do all of those factors and the geographic variation at play, what does that all mean for the viability and role of tenant organizing as a sort of national project for the American left?
So we are talking with tenant unions all over the state. So I'm in New York City right now, but I have spent a lot of time supporting and developing tenant unions in places like Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and Ithaca, which are majority renter cities, but where homeownership still feels like it's affordable, or where people would think that homeownership might be affordable. And a couple things I just want to say about these cities. These are like post-industrial sort of manufacturing centers, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, that have a lot more in common with the Midwest than they do with New York City in general, in terms of like what the cities are like. And the decline in manufacturing jobs combined with like a rise in like sort of university type jobs, but also a lot of like adjunct labor or temporary jobs at universities has basically meant that like the cities are both relying on real estate gentrification to like propel their economy in a way that wasn't true historically. And people are working in really precarious jobs in these places if they are employed. And so that's like created actually pretty strong conditions for tenant union organizing in places like Rochester, where I'm from. And the Rochester Citywide Tenant Union has had a huge amount of success coming out of the foreclosure crisis at building a really robust tenant union that is fighting slumlords and fighting for stronger tenant protections at the city level and the state level in a place like Rochester, which looks more like most American cities than New York City does. I actually think that the conditions for tenant union organizing outside of New York City and LA and San Francisco and the Bay Area are really exciting. And I think some of the most creative tenant organizing is happening in those places, in part because the protections are so much legally less. I found in New York City, people really rely on the existing framework of rent control, and it has like created a huge amount of tenant power and the conditions for organizing. But also, organizers are super creative in other places at ways in which they are confronting landlords, building tenant unions, building, community organizations that are fighting for protections and in places where they don't really exist even right now. So those are some of like the fiercest and most creative organizers that I've been happy to work with. And I think the economic conditions are there in those cities as well as they become more majority renter, and wages are not going up. People are not becoming homeowners in Rochester. So I do think that there's opportunity everywhere.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Well, first of all, Sia, thank you for acknowledging just like Western New York versus New York City. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and I always have to explain that Pittsburgh and Erie are not the East Coast, but they have similar sort of backgrounds. I grew up in Pittsburgh as, former manufacturing hubs. But one thing that struck me when you were talking about those cities is that, there was this whole paradigm of creative class redevelopment. And so all of these cities, even smaller, mid-sized American cities, not the big, SF, LA, New York, you still have seen over the last couple of decades, especially this sort of race to the bottom for, where there's all these tax breaks to attract capital, there's all these attempts at revitalization, and there's always gentrification, displacement, urban renewal 2.0 that comes with that. And so that's where, the sort of terrain of struggle is a lot richer than just what's happening, in these sort of more heavily renter cities like San Francisco or LA or New York. Seeing that in California in particular, where the frontier of tenant union organizing is right now in California, which alone has 40 million people in it. Yes, what we're seeing in Fresno or what we're seeing in the Inland Empire or the Central Valley, for example, where there are a lot of farm workers, and has a very different politics. It is very different from what we might be seeing that our members are working on in Oakland or Berkeley or LA. But, I think that is where a lot of exciting things are happening, and particularly broadening traditional tenant organizing to struggles over land, which I think that's actually a unifying factor, because the struggle over land, whether you're, organizing rurally, whether you're organizing in a, coastal metropolis or any sort of city in between, I think that is particularly one frontier that of organizing that's really, really broadened, and I think is being applied really broadly because we all live on land for now, unless you're Peter Thiel.
Law 2 was really essential to the formation of the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, and this is a national network of autonomous unions who are getting together regularly to share strategies. And we had our first in-person convention in Los Angeles in June. And I think, the experience of hearing from Omaha, from Sacramento, I think what you recognize is both, like, as you both were saying, the kind of script of gentrification and then like slumification, or that script of investment and disinvestment as the dual process that we're seeing, right? Like the spatial fix for capital is a global project, right? So we see it everywhere. But then when we think of like, what's the strategies that people are using in smaller communities under the context of abandonment, it's like one of the focuses of the convention I'm thinking about was how to organize in single family homes when you don't share the same landlord as someone else. And so for us, thinking about how that like territorial imperative of organizing, right? Like producing a kind of communal life of the dignity of tenants on your block, like as a community that like your block are the people who are going to rise to defend you from your landlord, from an absentee landlord. So I feel like situating like these tactics that we also use here, right? Like we base our struggles in our local chapters at, like in LA, we're lucky enough to have backyards. Or alleys or front yards or front steps. So we're like situating meetings like at these places. I'm thinking also, to prepare for today, I was reading the Los Angeles Tenant Union does an annual naming the moment process, which is like a broad popular education process to reflect on our work every year. And one of the things that they did in 2022 was name the strategy of reclaiming space. So I feel like what I'm seeing in a lot of unions across the country is alighting on these similar strategies of how do you build community even in a disinvested place, in an overinvested place, and that those strategies are actually the same and we have so much to learn from each other.
Renee?
Yeah, just to add to all of that, I think actually Tracy in some ways covered some of the stuff that I really wanted to land on. But I'm also thinking about the Atun convention this past summer, because not only did we, I think, discuss the differences in, kind of organizing, like you said, the differences between organizing single family home tenants as opposed to those in apartment complexes, and in a place like LA and certainly in New York, organizing around multifamily homes is very much the sine qua non of tenant organizing in a lot of ways, right? It's not the easy, it's the necessary component or vessel, right, for our organizing efforts, because you have a lot of people in one place, right? And organizing across portfolios of single family homes has always been very difficult, right? And for some of us who were around in 2008, 2009, we definitely remember what that looked like, right? And the difficulty of organizing people who were losing their single family homes across the country. In terms of the folks that we're organizing, that also shifts, right? One of our key organizers in LA, at the LA Tenants Union, I remember him mentioning at the Atun convention that the preponderance of Latinos, of Hispanic tenants in LA, it's such an overwhelming number of the folks who rent in the city. That alone also shifts, the demographic composition of renters has an effect in how we reach out to, how we, contact and connect with our tenants, right? We should always be recognizing how those kind of cultural differences also have an effect in how we organize. So many of the Latinos who, we organize in LA are folks who used to organize back home. And by back home, I mean back in their home countries, where some folks have been dispossessed because of things like warfare, right? And I mean very large proportions of the Hispanic population in Los Angeles have moved here because of fairly recent, conflicts in places like Central America, right? And so that kind of difference, that also that historical memory, right, that people bring to their lives in our major urban centers might be different, right, to the experience of the folks that you might organize in smaller rural areas and smaller suburban areas of other parts of the country, right? In terms of the terrain in other ways, I think Sia kind of touched on this a little bit on New York, but we can write this a little bit larger. Tenants' rights don't exist in large parts of the country. In our renter-heavy cities, yes, there are tenants' rights to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, right, depending on what jurisdiction you go to. But you go to places, again, like Omaha, if you go to places like Nebraska, wherever it is that you go in other parts of the country.
Rhode Island.
And Rhode Island, you're going to find that tenants have no tenants' rights really to speak of. And that does have a fundamental shift, or it causes a shift in how you have to organize, because it means that the kind of protections that we can rely on the West Coast and New York to be able to ensure that tenants aren't being pushed out automatically or immediately just because they're organizing and talking to their neighbors, that's a reality that we have to be sensitive to, right? We can't just say to people that all tenants can take the same types of risks in different places because they don't have the same types of protections that can allow them to take those risks, right? So that's something that I think is important for us to remember. I know that Shanti is also, and others have already talked a little bit about, or Tracy, I think you started describing what I like to sometimes call or to think about as like essentially the combined and uneven, real estate development that marks the process of gentrification, right? I know so many of the folks I've worked with over my life in both organizations I've worked in and organizations I've, volunteer organized in. That question that haunts us: what's going to happen when our cities lose their communities of color, when they become less working class, cities? Not to pick on you, Shanti, but what they become a little bit more like San Francisco than they do or are like Los Angeles, which is still very much a kind of logistical hub, a manufacturing and textiles hub, right? At the national level. I think these are questions that I think we do constantly wrestle with. We have to push ourselves into thinking, if we can no longer organize the tenant working class in a place like Los Angeles, what are we going to do to organize them in places like San Bernardino, right? I think these are issues that do keep us up at night. At least it does for me. And the final thing I'd say, I think, to the question of what does it look like to organize that 35% of the population at the national level? To me, there's a very clear parallel, frankly, to the industrial proletariat. And I mean that in the sense that, so much of the writing in Marxist literature, right, about, or in Marxist literature about, organizing the working class, I think sometimes elides the fact that the industrial working class has, at various points in time, in fact, for most of its history, has not been the majority of the population of the countries of the developed world. Right. And yet when you read.
And it definitely wasn't in Russia.
Absolutely. And yet you read the literature and oftentimes it makes it sound as though it were. I think that question of the role of a minority that is so central to, capitalist accumulation in land, or this as the spatial fix, as Tracy kind of described it, that does play a very important and I think growing role in how capitalism is able to recycle surplus, right, value. And for that reason, we do have to take seriously the fact that this, yes, minority of the American population is also playing or is living at the thin edge of the wedge, basically, of capitalist dynamics on a global scale. Because ultimately, the houses that we live in are being bought up by money that is coming in, it's being hoovered up from all across the world. I think these are dynamics that matter. And when we think about who are the folks that we're organizing in our cities, ultimately we are organizing people who are experiencing kind of that double whammy between, precarity at work, but also increasingly precarity in their homes.
Sometimes you hear on the left that tenants and tenant organizing doesn't have the same possible sort of leverage that organizing workers on the shop floor does. What's your case for the strategic viability and importance of this work? And why do you think it sometimes attracts some doubts? And to put my cards on the table, I'm a tenant organizer, so obviously I do strongly believe in tenant organizing. But I do, from my experience, think that there are ways in which it does seem sometimes harder to form a tenant union that, say, covers the entirety of a single landlord in Rhode Island, the same way that a union can represent the entirety of a boss's workers in the state. And that there are maybe also ways in which tenant organizing, while critical, doesn't seem, and this is from my perspective in Rhode Island, have the same potential leverage as workers at the point of production. But maybe that's just under present conditions and under local conditions. And maybe what I'm experiencing is more contingent.
I think that Tracy put it well when she talked about the sort of collective potential of being able to control your block, whether or not you have different landlords on that block. So when you try to think about the potential of tenant organizing as like going after one company or organizing a portfolio of landlords, it can seem sort of insurmountable and hard. And then a lot of tensions come up around like property ownership and working class homeowners and how they engage with tenant organizing, and what does it mean when some sectors of the working class have all of their wealth in land. And so, or like any potential for wealth in land. And even if they don't, even if we know that people are sort of saddled with a mortgage and not truly in control of their homes, I do think that there is like a sort of like homeowner identity that is like really intrinsic to how people think about capitalism in America that we have to like overcome. And, I think the work to sort of build a tenant identity is good. So when you think about it at sort of that scale, it can feel overwhelming, but I still think it's like so incredibly strategic. And the reason why is that, one, I think sort of like land and land ownership is sort of central to the understanding of American capitalism and how wealth is accumulated in this country in particular. So that's like the first. And the second thing is that real estate is overwhelmingly just more and more at the heart of every single major industry in this country. So like the major landlords is also the major employer. And I don't mean that at the level of like a private equity company owns housing and owns like a company. That's not what I mean. I mean like...
But like a university.
I mean, New York University owns tons of rental housing in Lower Manhattan, actually all over the city, and also is a major employer of precarious workers. And cities like that is true in many, many, many cities, not just New York, where a university or a hospital has become both like the major landlord, the major employer for the entire town. And so organizing tenants at the same time as you're organizing workers, or organizing tenants together with workers, feels just so incredibly important. And then like every major employer, their wealth, their endowment is invested in the real estate market. And so that's just sort of something else we have to figure out as well. And so sort of figuring out ways that tenants are strategic interrupters of capitalist accumulation is very, very important, though I agree that it's not happening in the same way as you're organizing everyone who works in a General Motors factory. It's not going to look like that. It's going to look different, but tenants still have this like core economic role, and we're experimenting and figuring out how to make it happen.
I really resonate with a lot of what you said, Sia. And I mean, for me, I feel like, it's just important to name that a lot of the resistance to the strategic capacity of tenants is sexism, right? And like we in Latu have made a very specific effort to, in our strategy, name our movement as a women's movement. And like what that means for me as a queer person, like what that means for the men in our movement, like that's something else, like, but it is a women's movement because women are tasked with the care of the home, and that is the site of struggle that is being organized. And so I think it's just really important that we name that. At the same time, we can name like I'm thinking about all of the things that are like obstacles to our organizing that are also like some of the immense strengths of the tenant movement. Like the tenant movement is a catch-all for like all of the crises of our time. Like if you think about the crime panic and the way that people are, when you're organizing tenants, one of the things that you have to face is people's like animosity to unhoused people in their buildings, in their presence. You think about package theft. And so like if you want a basis for an abolitionist practice, the tenant movement is that place. We can organize safety in our buildings, like by restoring the communal life of buildings, restoring the communal life of our blocks. I mean, one of the progenitors of Latu is Union de Vecinos. My mentor, Leonardo Vilches, tells a story of, how organizing the neighbors on blocks was the production of community safety against gangs and simultaneously against the police. And then I think too, like right now in New York, one of the tensions that's coming up is, frankly, understandable anti-Semitism in Black communities that comes from having decades of Jewish landlords, right? So like this is a terrain of struggle. Similarly in, a crisis of care work where so many people are having to do the labor of a second or third full-time shift in caring for people in their homes. And so like the work of the tenant movement is, I think, that can, be abolitionist, anti-racist, feminist. It's like all of these things that we like might name in the abstract as goals. It's like, well, this is the material that we work with when we think about neighborliness as a political and material force. And I think that for me, like alongside thinking about its strategic capacity, and I think we also have to think about that. Like, I will say too, right? Like I was thinking about the UC strike, and that the capacity for rent burdens to both animate that strike, their demand to put COLA in their contract was a strategy about leveraging the UC system, which is a supposedly public university, which has $4 billion invested in Blackstone right now. And so I think that like that is one shape of the tenant movement right now, is these strategic point of leverage, as well as the kind of daily work of some of the most difficult tasks of our time.
Renee?
I think when people, I'm going to kind of go a little bit on some of my comrades, right, in the broader socialist movement here, to say when people question the quote unquote strategic viability of organizing tenants, as though it weren't something that is quite literally happening already. I just think to myself, what's the point really? What's the value in doing that when your comrades are actually already organizing renters and their hundreds and their thousands, right? And in fact, I do look at the experience of what has happened in the LA Tenants Union as very kind of edifying to that extent. And I say this especially because we recently had our annual assembly that was one of the most beautiful gatherings I've ever been to, that had so much of our working class base present. There were so many people in that room. I was so shocked, in fact, by how successful it had been. It really kind of put to shame, frankly, that question that people will often have about what the value of organizing tenants where they live is. So I just, in a way, I'm allergic to that question a little bit, because this is something that is happening as we speak. It does, though, speak to structural difficulties or differences, right, between organizing labor and organizing tenants in their respective sites of struggle. There is no Wagner Act for organizing tenants, although there have been efforts and some legislation passed to enable tenant organizing to happen. And I know folks in New York have actually thought about a little bit more, right, what that right to organize looks like. But there is no Wagner Act. It means that we do, as Tracy and Sia have both said, it doesn't mean we have to organize at the block level. We have to organize. It's a very gritty and difficult effort to have to organize people at the worm's eye level. And in fact, an uncomfortable effort, because you have to organize the people that you live with, right? That is a very viscerally different sort of process, I would say, to organizing folks at work, where you, again, have been alienated from each other. And, you were forced to be in this kind of alien space to be able to feed yourself, to provide for your family, your household, etc. Right? That is a very different thing. But I think there's also, frankly, another tendency in the left that I think we have to knock back in kind of proposing or asking that question, which is a lot of leftists, a lot of armchair leftist generals always like to talk at the macro level and don't want to have to think about what happens or how what happens at the micro level, what happens at the block by block or building level, what happens on the individual side of struggle is what creates the conditions, what shapes, what frames what the macro conditions of the working class look like. Or to put it differently, for us, organizing tenants on the ground level is what is at precisely the thing that shifts the conditions of the working class writ large in, again, they're at the side of struggle for work. When it comes to even kind of political rights, or we'll call like civil rights, right? Broadly speaking. So I just think that there is that tendency to always want to talk in these kind of broad strokes, world historical levels, and not have to engage in frankly, the dirty work of organizing on the ground level. I think that is what motivates, I think, oftentimes a lot of that skepticism. I do want to also point out on the question of private equity. Tracy's already talked about how the University of California, like in New York, is both a landowner and a quote unquote provider of educational services, as well as a gigantic boss at the state level in places like California, right? Labor unions themselves are cottoning on to the importance of organizing the tenants of private equity landlords, because they know, again, ultimately they are fighting the same sort of multi-headed hydra, right?
Really, that's happening. Labor unions?
Yeah, shockingly it is. Yes, I mean in Fantastic. California, I've had conversations with folks at Unite Here Local 11, for example. I know SEIU, multiple SEIU locals very much recognize that there is an imperative, right, to link up to work with tenants unions, tenant organizations that work with tenants, period. They understand that is a complementary, a vital second role that they have to play, even if they themselves are not the folks who are organizing the tenants, right? And so with Unite Here, for example, they have reached out multiple times in various capacities to try to see if we can work together to organize against particular private equity targets. To me, that is a recognition that no one can escape a kind of, at this point, ineluctable process that is increasingly capturing more and more of our neighborhoods and also influencing more and more of our workplaces. I think that is a recognition that more and more labor unions themselves will come to with time.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly news to hear. And I mean, just this morning, I was communicating with someone from the National Education Association in Rhode Island because one of their members, she's a custodian, is also a tenant leader of ours who's facing a retaliatory termination of her lease. And so we're extremely interested in pursuing collaboration with organized labor in Rhode Island. Shanti.
I was gonna say too. I mean, now that Renee made me sort of reminisce about even just being a baby organizer in San Francisco and how how labor unions are increasingly involved in state level and local housing justice work in California, and that's always been my experience. It's great to see it more. Renee took one of my main points, which was that there is, like, as he recognized, there is no right to organize for tenants. So to go back to your question, Dan, like that there's a lot of organizing that could be happening in tenant organizing that maybe is being chilled by the fact that, there is not really in most places any kind of framework to prevent that exact kind of retaliation. Right. So there is that chilling effect there. I think we have to keep that in mind. Even, I'm not saying, obviously, it's not sunshine and roses for the labor movement right now, or in terms of the strength of their right to organize. But in most places, when it comes to tenant organizing, we have none at all. So, Renee touched on that point. But if I can be, if there is also, I think, a global macro level argument for tenant organizing in America specifically, or tenant organizing in the imperial core, which is that it's the sort of US, UK model of hooking every tenant up or hooking every member of your society up to the international financial market for real estate speculation. That model is being exported aggressively and has been for a couple decades now, especially post 2008, to, the rapidly urbanizing global South. Right? It's a huge, that real estate financialization is a huge component of sort of, this paradigm of international development. So if as socialists we are fighting an international struggle against capital, we have to look particularly in America as to how, our systems, our financial behemoths, our struggles are essentially in a bad way really being exported to the rest of the world, where the fastest growing cities in the world are. They're predominantly in the global South. So if we're going to have an international struggle and against capital, which I think most of my comrades in the movement think that we need to have, then I do think there is a role, a pretty strong role for tenant organizing in the imperial core to influence that and talk about that, because this is something that, revisiting Urban Warfare, a fantastic book by Raquel Rolnick, who used to be the UN Special Rapporteur on housing, she talks about this idea of mortgaged lives, right? And it's, she's taking a global view, obviously, given her job, on housing insecurity, on urbanization, on tenancy in general. But, she makes a very convincing argument, and I agree with this. I mean, real estate financialization is the global model now, and it's being modeled in a bad way after everything, the messed upness of the U.S., to use a scientific term. So,
do you mind if I add one
Go
more
ahead.
thing?
No, please.
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead.
It's just because if we're thinking, I was really interested in the UC strike specifically as a tenant organizer, right? And I wrote about it for the New Republic, and what I found, which really, on the one hand, surprised me, but on the other hand, confirmed something that I was maybe suspicious of, is that in many ways, that strike was inspired by a group of failed tenant organizers in Santa Cruz. They set out to organize for rent control and failed. They set out to organize the tenants of UC, like as a landlord, and failed. And then they directed themselves to their employer because they could not afford rent. So they leveraged the idea of a rent burden to say, like, well, we should be able to afford to live where we work, and therefore we shouldn't live with rent burden. And by, like their wildcat strike, I think is like everyone across the union credits that concept and that effort with, the mass effort that we saw. And then, I mean, I have to say, like, it seems to me and what I've heard that demand for COLA that was very quickly shut down by what seemed like UAW leadership. And so I think that there is like the idea of the tenant movement becoming a part of the labor movement, right? That like we are addressed, like that the grad workers of UC were addressing themselves to their employer in order to constrain the UC's capacity to raise rents for everyone in California. And I feel like that made their struggle had the potential to affect tenants across the state. And I think that is really, I think we saw both. That was a moment where the potential of those connections really erupted. We didn't see it happen, but they did build like an incredible amount of infrastructure for what will happen next time. And of course, like right after the strike, the UC announced a $4.5 billion investment in Blackstone. So I feel like these kinds of connections are really like going to be really have to be part of the tenant movement going forward.
I just want to add really quickly that since people have talked about the UC Blackstone investment, it was interesting too at the same time that UC chose to invest in Blackstone. Blackstone is saying on its investor calls that part of the insane returns that they're promising UC, for example, an 11% return, which is pretty high. But on their investor calls, they're telling their investors in the Blackstone REIT, right, the Real Estate Investment Trust, that part of how they're going to realize these astronomical promised returns is to jack up rents on student housing, on their portfolio of student housing. So there was a real snake eating itself element of that the last couple of weeks.
Well, and generally also increase evictions right across the board. So yeah, these things are intimately linked. I think all of us could spend an hour just talking about how these folks are basically, attacking from both ends, basically.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Afterlife, a collective history of loss and redemption in pandemic America, edited by Ray Lynn Barnes, Carrie Lee Merritt, and Yohuru Williams. Afterlife is a collective history of how Americans experienced, navigated, commemorated, and ignored mass death and loss during the global COVID-19 pandemic, mass uprisings for racial justice, and the January 6th insurrection. Inspired by the writers who documented American life for the Works Progress Administration, the editors asked contemporary historians and legal experts to focus on the parallels, convergences, and differences between the exceptional long 2020 and earlier eras in U.S. history. As Sarah Jaffe puts it, in this moment, when plague reality continues to underscore how undercared for we all are, reading Afterlife has been a balm. Afterlife, out now from Haymarket Books, and available on haymarketbooks.org, where US and UK readers receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £25, respectively. To talk more about the nuts and bolts of this work, at Reclaim Rhode Island, we're organizing tenants of this slumlord Pioneer Investments. It's a medium-sized, I think would be the correct term, landlord with 60-odd multifamily properties across multiple cities and towns in the state. So maybe 200-plus units, we're not entirely sure. And then some unknown, we think smaller number, we haven't fully researched, across the state line in Massachusetts. And we're knocking all of the doors in Rhode Island. We're forming city and town level hubs. Is what we're doing in terms of trying to organize an entire slumlord portfolio of small multifamily buildings spread out across the state in the way they are. Is that unusual? Do most tenant organizing campaigns target particular landlords or more just particular larger buildings, or is it sometimes more, and I think you all have referred to this a few times, across a neighborhood where people have different landlords entirely? What's the sort of array of sorts of organizing that you're either involved in or have heard of, and what are the implications of the differences between those approaches?
I think that the conditions of struggle are going to determine the type of organizing that you do, right? In a place like Rhode Island, that is it's a smaller place. A lot of the communities that you are organizing are going to look fundamentally, radically different to what they would look like in New York and LA. That is going to have a marked differentiation, or it's going to have a marked impact on what the organizing is going to look like. I think there's a lot of value in starting off with a portfolio-wide organizing effort, because it also provides for the possibility of doing the neighborhood level organizing that you're going to need to do later on as well. Except you're going to do it with pre-existing infrastructure, right? And pre-existing organizing efforts that can be the seed or the foundation for organizing other renters who might have, yes, different scale landlords, but who are going to be facing a lot of the same conditions. I don't think I need to, belabor the point that Shanti, Sia, and Tracy will know about well, that when you put any tenant in a room together, any series of tenants in a room together, they can have a private equity landlord, they can have a tiny slumlord who owns a duplex only, and a landlord that kind of falls somewhere in between, and their conditions, their experiences are going to be shared. It is so fundamental, in fact, to the popular education model within the LA Tenants Union that we start with that, very basic experience of tenancy and how that experience is shared across these different households, these different parts of a city, right? And so you're going to find the problems with habitability. You're going to find the problems with unjust rent increases. You're going to find the problems of landlord harassment. All of these things are things that are going to be able to unite those folks together. So ultimately, to me, the question of how you begin, organizing something like a tenant union, I think has to depend on, who are what is the ragtag army of organizers that you've cobbled together to want to come together and achieve this project. And then also, what are the conditions of the folks that you're organizing? How does that lead you down a different sort of, organizing path? When I think of, at least in my experience, when I've organized tenants and organized rent strikes, they have oftentimes started as organizing one building that then have quickly become trying to organize a portfolio the moment it became obvious that that same landlord maintained their buildings in the exact same conditions with horrible rent increases on top of that in other buildings in other parts of the city. And also when it became obvious that the landlord could absorb a large enough rent strike on their own because they had enough wealth, they had enough income also flowing in from different properties within that portfolio. Suddenly, there is a strategic decision that we had to take to be able to target those other buildings that the landlord had. That is, I guess all of that is to counsel that you start with the struggle that you have in front of you at any given point in time. You're going to have to start with where the tenants themselves are and the landlord they are confronting. That is going to open up the doors or is going to really decide for you what is going to be the right kind of organizing choice after that. I will say, though, one final thing here is that organizing in a city like LA, and I'm sure like New York and other large cities, does contour or frame the organizing effort a little bit differently, because you also have different types of landlords at different scale, perhaps, than you would get in smaller communities. That means that you are going to be confronting these landlords who you will not be able to potentially, you're not going to risk their entire profitability by leading, a small number of units or a small number of buildings even onto rent strike. You're not going to threaten that viability as a business in the same way than you would if you were just dealing with a smaller, quote unquote, mom and pop landlord. that means that you have to adopt different tactics to be able to respond to that. And so again, there in the same way that there are no shortcuts, there are also no guidebooks for how you organize this stuff. I think it starts with who do you have in front of you who can do the organizing, and who are the tenants that you're organizing first.
I also, just to build on what you said, Renee, I feel like from Latu's perspective, I feel like, our local chapters are autonomous, which means that we don't have a standard methodology for organizing, and our local chapters look vastly different from one another. Like East Hollywood is really focused around direct action. Like as soon as there is a organized building and repair needs, they are going to the landlord's house with eviction notices for the landlord. Our East Side local Union de Vecinos is really built around block associations and producing the kind of community in and taking over space, doing community events, cleaning streets, putting in guerrilla crosswalks, like taking over the life of the city. The Northeast local is, formed around really based around conversations about what are you going through? What strategies are you using? And, we have like a K3 tenant council, which is organizing buildings across one portfolio. But I also think that, one of these things that we're learning as a union is that that these are really different kinds of organizing cultures. There's not one that's necessarily going to be the right one. But if when we see something that what works is a local chapter that is, growing and that people take ownership over. And I think that there's a lot of different methods to get there. And I think that that's one of the more exciting things about the Los Angeles Tenant Union, given that we're dues funded and that we're all volunteer, is that the capacity for different cultures to emerge is where it's really a space where many different kinds of cultures can emerge and many different kinds of strategies can emerge. And then it's our job to sort of corral them, to teach each other, to use the union as an archive of everything that we've done and teach each other what to do next.
Sia?
I really agree with that. I think the most important thing is how you are supporting tenants in, developing how tenant organizers are developing capacity at the building or the block level of tenants themselves to directly take on the work of the organizing campaign, and continually growing the base and growing the base of leaders who are going to drive the work forward. That's the most important thing. And we are not big enough as a housing movement to avoid any hot chops. So if I were to give you any advice, I would say, just because if someone comes to you and wants to organize, but they don't live in the buildings owned by Pioneer Investments, you shouldn't say, well, they don't have a role. I think our goal as organizers is to create, tons of different organizing cultures depending on the moment, onboard people into the work frequently and often, and give them the capacity and the power to continually grow the movement. We need a diversity of tactics and a diversity of strategies. The one that hasn't come up that we have experimented with in the past and we are not experimenting with so much right now is organizing against landlords that are in a particular lender's portfolio. Even if the landlord is maybe different, they all have the same mortgager. A lot of the times we've found that certain rent terms can be written into a mortgage or promised to investors. And so there's a way in which you can exert pressure over a landlord through going after a bank, and you can build a larger sort of a consolidated target by going after a particular lender at the same time as you're going after a landlord. And all of these are just different ways to sort of identify targets and create pressure. The last thing I would just say about sort of portfolio side organizing, I organized with the Crown Heights Tenant Union for many years. And we started the Crown Heights Tenant Union organizing multifamily buildings in foreclosure. And the goal was to support renters in using this moment while the buildings were in foreclosure to build tenant unions in the neighborhood and interrupt the sort of really brutal gentrification that was sweeping through Crown Heights at the time. So we brought together tenants who were trying to like fight for decent living conditions at the building level after landlords had effectively walked away, and to win sort of control and dignity as those buildings went through the process of foreclosure. The buildings are all flipped to new private equity companies, and we made a lot of progress in getting one of the corporate landlords who bought all of these buildings in Crown Heights to sort of like sign an agreement with the tenants around, 5-year lease terms and a bunch of other things like that the tenants had wanted. And then as soon as, we came to this meeting, tenants negotiated with the landlord. It was amazing. And then like the next thing that happened is the landlord flipped the building. And so that happens and then you're like back at square one. So I think this like emphasis on leadership development and capacity building of the union to be able to continually be organizing and exerting their own power is so critical in a world where real estate speculation means that landlords are just constantly flipping buildings. Whenever we start to get traction at a building level, we see the landlord try to sell it. And at the same time, we have found that it is much harder for landlords to sell buildings when the tenants are on a visible rent strike. So I don't know, organizing is a way to interrupt the value of the building as it gets bought and sold. And so really thinking about how preventing landlords from buying and selling buildings by targeting the people who they owe money to is something else that you can bring into this. But strongly agree that all styles and cultures need to be nurtured and recognized and welcomed if we're going to build any type of tenant power that at the scale we need to win.
Shanti?
Yeah, I think between Sia, Tracy, and Renee, they've got most of this covered already, but I will just add to that. I mean, I kind of tend to take the approach right now that there are no wrong answers here. When people, I'm always astonished, particularly like working at a coalition where our members, some of these are building size tenant unions, some of these are citywide tenant unions, some of them are autonomous tenant unions like the Pasadena Tenants Union or the LA Tenants Union. Some of them are organizing across a particular landlord portfolio like the Veritas Tenants Committee here in San Francisco, which is organizing against the biggest corporate landlord in the city and recently went on a successful debt strike. I hear new ideas from folks, particularly because we're not, at Tenants Together, we're not just a coalition of the tenant unions that exist, but the point is to actually support the formation of new tenant unions. And so, grow the movement that way, especially geographically. And, I hear great new ideas from people all the time. Just last week, we were talking to a new member organization in Orange County who's actually going to be organizing by city council district, which is something I hadn't even thought of before, because that's basically part of their power building strategy. So I guess it's really just about being really open-minded, because I honestly, I've been doing this myself, been a tenant organizer for a quarter of my life, and pretty much every day I hear a new idea that sounds really great.
What about public housing tenants? Have any of you organized Section 9 or project-based Section 8 developments? What sort of opportunities for power building might exist there, and how do those compare to the situation with private landlord tenants?
So I think, yes, I have done organizing in project-based Section 8 and Section 9 buildings. I want to say one of the things about organizing in NYCHA, in our New York City Section 9 housing, is that the sort of continual divestment in public housing year after year after year from the federal government has created a huge amount of sort of disillusionment, sort of like lack of belief in organizing maybe. And so that's like the sort of disorganization and apathy. And apathy is really the wrong word. It's sort of like anger and a lack of belief that like winning is possible is a huge barrier in public housing organizing. And the other sort of interesting factor, both in project-based Section 8 and Section 9 housing, is that there are like established tenant associations that have some degree of like, I don't know, they're in the bureaucracy of Section 9 and Section 8 housing, that there are these like HUD established TAs that have like a pretty close relationship to the New York political establishment here in New York. And so that's just sort of like another another factor that impacts sort of like autonomous tenant union organizing in the building. How are you engaging with the sort of existing TA? Do you want to be running people to take over the existing TA or participate in the existing TA or like working with the existing TA? So there's like these sort of interdynamics. And then I would say that like the vast majority of low-income and working-class renters in the United States live in the private rental market and are extremely oppressed and disempowered in the private rental market. And so anything that we can do to be strengthening protections of tenants in the private market and building strong tenant unions that can take over their buildings and like exert their vision for their buildings and like bring more control over the sort of private real estate industry, the stronger the possibilities for tenant power building in Section 9 housing are as well. Because what we really try to do with private market organizing is like sort of eliminate the vast profit difference between the private market housing and the public housing. And so by sort of reducing the speculative value of private real estate on one hand and through tenant power building and strengthening the capacity of tenant organizing in Section 9 and Section 8 housing, we're sort of just like bringing the whole universe of renters closer together. And right now, I think the real estate industry really benefits from how fractured our regulatory framework is. You've got some LIHTC people over here, you've got some rent stabilization over here, Section 9, Section 8, everyone's got different rules. It's designed to confuse us and disempower us and disempower tenants as like a class of people. So it's really challenging to overcome those distinctions. And yeah, I think we really do want to try to figure out how organizing in the private market can be in deep solidarity and strengthen the capacity for organizing within the public housing system as well.
Tracy?
You know, one of the progenitor struggles to the formation of the Los Angeles Tenant Union was that of the residents of Pico Aliso, which used to be the largest public housing block west of the Mississippi. And it was destroyed under Clinton's Hope 6 and replaced with, in part, with fewer units, first of all, but then privately owned, publicly subsidized, quote unquote, affordable housing. And the struggle of these tenants was to keep their buildings, that the idea that Union de Vecinos was formed because tenants wanted to stay and they did not see the destruction of their communities as the improvement of their communities. And this group that even though they lost this fight, continued to struggle for their communities. And the thing that really brought me into the tenant movement was the boycott of art galleries in Boyle Heights in the early 2010s that was led by residents of public housing in the community. These tenants were present at the first meeting of the Los Angeles Tenant Union. And so now one of our fights is in Hillside Villa in Chinatown, which is a privately owned multifamily. It has 140 units that is both subsidized through LIHTC, meaning it's affordable housing, and also the landlord accepts Section 8. And so the tenants in this building realized that their affordability covenant was going to expire. So they are living in the failures of what was presented as the solutions to other of our members, right? They're living in the failure of like democratic policymaking and consensus. And and the landlord himself has said, well, everyone should just get on Section 8 because I get that money like clockwork. And the residents, I always quote her, says, get on Section 8 is landlord for fuck you. And what they are struggling to do right now and have made massive strides considering the horizon is to force the city to purchase the building using eminent domain. What their 3-year-long struggle, which has had to take place in 3 different languages across 2 different kinds of legal statuses of housing tenure, right? As Sia was saying, that this is like a disorganization strategy to have tenants in these different legal environments, is they've consensed on the demand that the private owner, it is the problem of the private ownership of the building that is going to see them expelled from their long-term communities and their homes. So their demand has been to use eminent domain to take the building out of private ownership away from this landlord who is trying to evict them. And they've chosen to remain in solidarity by saying, it's the private ownership of the building that is destroying it. And the thing that we want for us is control over our building and stability for ourselves. And so I see these kinds of specifically organizing in Section 8 buildings as a really important site of our struggle, because it really illuminates the kind of failure of the consensus solution that we're being given right now.
And just to clarify for listeners, LIHTC are low-income housing tax credits, a complex subsidy system that I won't explain right now, but it's basically replaced both traditional Section 9 public housing, which is what you think about when you hear the words the projects, or voucher-based or project-based Section 8 forms of public housing, which are already a form of privatizing traditional public housing. That has been overwhelmingly displaced by LIHTC in recent decades as the dominant form of affordable housing in the country. And yet these units are only guaranteed to be affordable for, I believe, 15 or 30 years, depending on the situation.
Sometimes it can go up to 50.
Up to 50.
55, yeah.
But they're covenanted.
It also depends on your, yeah. It also depends on your state. Like your LIHTC is 15 years minimum, and then all over the country, you're going to have a different framework.
It's also, it is the predominant way of financing subsidized housing, but I mean, it's private investor tax credit. Someone is making a profit off of it. It is the most, Rube Goldberg method of replacing direct public investment in housing imaginable, right? And I would even argue that it's worse than Section 8 because at least vouchers are sort of, I'm not romanticizing Section 8 by any means.
Well, it's so interesting because one of the things about all of this is LIHTC doesn't even require the housing to be affordable at 30% of the tenant's income. It requires it to be sort of initially income targeted to people at 60% of AMI, area median income. But all of these schemes it's intentionally confusing and intentionally abstracted and has created an entire cottage industry of affordable housing providers and syndicators and people who invest in the tax credits and da-da-da-da-da. So there are thousands and thousands of people who work in the LIHTC industry. It's a thing, and it's bizarre. But one of the reasons why tenant union organizing is so important, and tenant union organizing in subsidized housing, is that when you have your housing being paid for by LIHTC and you have also your housing being paid for by a voucher or something like that, you are sort of tremendously disempowered to fight for things like better living conditions in some way. If you call the city to come inspect your Section 8 rental apartment and the city sees that the landlord hasn't made a repair in 2 to 3 years of the roof or whatever, you're going to lose your rental subsidy or be forced to move. There's nowhere for you to go with that rental subsidy. And so there's this disempowering thing that happens with Section 8 and LIHTC where tenants are sort of interrupted from the economic power of their tenancy by the subsidy. And they are unable to go on a rent strike with their neighbors. And so there's lots of ways where a Section 8 voucher creates a division between someone who's paying their rent with a voucher versus someone who is paying their rent with their money. Because it doesn't go directly to the tenant. It goes to the landlord when the tenant fills out the right paperwork. And it creates it makes a tenant organizer's job very hard because you're in this shitty situation. You want to organize doing repairs, but you don't want people to lose their housing or their money. And so, this is one of the things that is winnable and changeable, but it's not winnable if people are doing it alone. We have created an affordable housing system that divides us, and we need to create an affordable housing system that's based in tenant power and collective action and not based on these sort of individualized subsidies that don't really help people pay the rent anyway.
Renee.
I think you also see it very palpably. I think you see the problem with Section 8 very palpably anytime you go canvass a building that has a mix of tenants, right? So there are so many experiences that I've had trying to go knocking on doors in places like South Central LA, where you will get a very marked difference in the response from Section 8 tenants, their ability, their desire to even want to talk to you on the one hand, but also a shared sort of suspicion that the non-Section 8 tenants have of those with Section 8 vouchers. They basically will tell you that the Section 8 tenants will oftentimes not talk to you. They won't talk to their neighbors whenever they want to organize around issues of habitability. But it comes back down to exactly what Sia was saying, right? If you fear that you're going to lose your voucher, and I unfortunately know too many folks who are constantly losing their vouchers because of these problems, you're going to be very cautious about what you're going to exercise as a right, as a tenant, right? And you're going to be very cautious about organizing with your neighbors. But going back to a couple of things, like we've been talking a little bit about LIHTC, we've been talking a little bit about public housing, just on the kind of affordable housing model period in this country, and specifically even in LA, there are thousands of units in the city of LA alone that are essentially about to be decovenanted, if you will, right? They are going to lose their affordable housing sort of mandate. Again, the struggle around Hillside Villa is really kind of an example of that, but it is one of, again, quite literally thousands of units in the city that is in a comparable sort of situation. And for cities like LA that are scrambling to try to preserve affordable housing as much as possible, this is going to be the elephant in the room for a lot of these jurisdictions in the next couple of years, because again, these covenants are expiring in different parts of the city and different parts of the state. One thing also on the that kind of the Byzantine nature of the bureaucracy around housing. This is a very common aspect of the welfare state in this country. Generally speaking, it is a common aspect of any sort of public intervention in the private market. We saw it with the emergency rental assistance program nationwide, very much so here in California, where the process was very difficult, very laborious for tenants to be able to apply to. That was by design. The same thing is something that we've seen in the non-housing world, right? With the student loan debacle from the White House, right? That the Debt Collective, we have a lot of experience with. This idea of having an application, even if it was the simplest application in the world, also ended up being something that has prevented now millions of people from receiving immediate relief on their student loans. We shouldn't be shocked at the fact that throughout the housing market, we basically, create these different sorts of conditions. Within the Debt Collective, we developed for the state of California this process, or this program called the Tenant Power Toolkit, that allows tenants to be able to file an answer to their eviction paperwork at any courthouse in the state. But that had to build a program like that also meant having to engage the very difficult and fractured nature of the housing market in California. That had to take into account the legal differences between Section 8 tenant voucher holders and those who are living in public housing as well. And on public housing, California doesn't have as much public housing. LA doesn't have as much public housing by quite by a country mile as New York. We don't have it because in the 1950s, the California Association of Realtors, or their original sort of iteration of that institution, as well as the landlords and the chambers of commerce, all came together and passed a constitutional amendment in California that made it all but impossible to develop new public housing after the 1950s. It is actually also part of the story of the eviction and, if you will, redevelopment that led to the creation of Dodger Stadium, because that was meant to be, or that situation was meant to be, that the tenants would be moved out of Chavez Ravine, what is today Dodger Stadium, and the tenants would be moved into public housing that would be near the stadium. That never happened because of the passage of this constitutional amendment here in California that limited that. I recently, about a year ago, my partner and I, we actually we were organizing a public housing estate, or more appropriately, a public housing estate in degeneration, right? It was a public housing estate that was being broken up piecemeal by a public-private partnership with some affordable housing developers. And you saw that very stark difference, basically, both in the quality of the housing that tenants were living in, but also in the response of tenant leadership, the official tenant leadership, to the demands of the tenants, but also to the pressures from the Public Housing Authority. This is a very common experience in organizing public housing tenants, I should say, that you will find official tenant leadership councils that are, in all but name, captured by the Public Housing Authority, that build a particular sort of relationship of dependency with the Public Housing Authority, and they will stifle efforts to organize the tenants from outside that structure as much as possible. Why? Because public housing authorities have experience, have decades of experience, right? Organizing to break up, if you will, more radical efforts by tenants to organize their buildings. And so we actually confronted that very nakedly in this kind of effort to organize some public housing tenants, Latino public housing tenants predominantly, who were trying to prevent being moved from their public housing units into the affordable housing units that were being built on public land. They were very clear about the fact that their rights as public housing tenants were stronger than they were with these affordable housing landlords in this private public sort of partnership. And it was terrifying, I should say, to hear the Public Housing Authority very nakedly using fears of racial animosity and racial tensions to play into that effort. They would basically, there was this one meeting that I was in that was surreal, where the Public Housing Authority brought a series of elder tenants who were Latino and the official RAC leadership that was predominantly Black. And then you had the Latino gentleman who had been brought by the Public Housing Authority very softly, but very clearly lecturing the Latino tenants who were trying to organize to stay in their public housing by reminding them of the specter of 1992, reminding them of the specter of the riots, and reminding them of the tension that led to Black and brown kids, killing each other on that public housing estate throughout the 1990s and definitely into the early 2000s. It was a horrifying spectacle, but very much an example of how these authorities are very good at creating these divisions and then proposing solutions or proposing unity that ultimately is meant to break up solidarity, break up organizing efforts, and meant to break up these kind of more radical demands by the tenants. And the most radical demand of all, to stay in that public housing unit to begin with. So that was a very, very clear lesson for me that it is still very vital to organize public housing tenants. And I also think, and this is something we could possibly touch on at some point today, it is still very necessary to grapple with the real history of what happened with public housing, how it was failed, and how that was a deliberate project by the state to create the frankly, Frankenstein-esque, housing market that we live in today.
What role does eviction defense play in a larger tenant organizing campaign? It's obviously essential, but how does that defensive work form part of a larger offensive strategy? And are there also risks around centering eviction defense in an organization and more generally centering emergency response to such an extent that it crowds out other collective efforts? Because there are, as you all know, constant emergencies that tenants are facing. How do you handle these in a way that build organizing power in the long run rather than distracting from doing so? And conversely, how do we build power over the medium and long term while also answering tenants' urgent needs or through answering tenants' urgent needs?
I guess I'll go. I don't right now. I mean, I don't. Ideally, we want tenants to be organized and aware of their rights well upstream of the possibility of them receiving an eviction notice. But I do think that eviction defense, I don't think it crowds out other forms of organizing. And I do think about it, I mean, as sort of, it is downstream. Ideally, we want to be so well organized that no one gets an eviction notice at all, but that's just not how it works. I think it's really important to think about the eviction machine in this country. And so eviction defense tactics, and it kind of goes into a broader discussion about what people think about as offensive versus defensive tactics. And sometimes in some corners, people, comrades may be a little dismissive of purely defensive tactics. But the fact of the matter is the way that eviction court and eviction processes work in America is like it's an incredibly streamlined process on the part of real estate, right? So anything that you can do in terms of eviction defense, especially collectively, but anything you can do in terms of eviction defense to gum up the works, right? I mean, I often say to people, if every tenant, and again, even like basic policies, that maybe some people would consider reformist, like right to counsel or things of that nature, all of these different policies, if every tenant had a lawyer, if every tenant knew their rights, or if every tenant were organized, et cetera, eviction court would simply break down. I mean, we're even seeing during COVID that eviction courts are unable. They're pretty rickety apparatuses. The only reason that they just have the legitimacy to just bring tenants in and just spit them out and evict them very, very quickly for no reason. That's the way that it's set up. But there is a value of eviction court as a site of struggle to really gum up the works there, because eviction court in America simply would not function. There are a lot of ways to break it down if every tenant, if more tenants were organized, or even little basic things like them having the right to legal defense. And as far as COVID's concerned, we really did see that. I mean, I forget exactly which city. I forget if it was Minneapolis or St. Paul. But somewhere where there was a Midwestern city where the Landlord Bar Association was recently complaining that they couldn't, take cases as fast as they were getting them, right? There's a lot of value in actually organizing around eviction court, and I think it's complementary to, organizing ahead of that process of a tenant getting a notice, because it's a system that can be, I think, toppled. I mean, it feels like it is a grinding machine, right? It's a lot to go up against, the legal system. But I think there are a lot more opportunities to mess it up and throw a wrench in it through organizing, especially that we need to look at as one of many strategies.
I mean, I think there's like two things here. There's one that's like eviction defense, sort of the way Shanti was describing, like sort of intervening at like eviction court as sort of just like a process intervention. There is so much that has happened upstream, right? As Shanti said, upstream of the time, but before someone gets to like the state of having an eviction that ideally has happened. But I think you're also sort of talking about sort of like emergency direct actions and eviction blockades, which are different from eviction defense, and like sort of that particularly as a tactic. And all of those tactics are incredible opportunities for people to feel a lot of power. You really can like get a landlord to give up, basically. You can, like, through a combination of both like legal strategy, direct action strategy, media strategy. Media strategy is like super important. It creates a spectacle around eviction and like forces a lot of people like who probably don't really think about tenant organizing from like a left perspective, but maybe like nice liberals who live in the neighborhood have to like take a position, and they're probably going to want to side with us, maybe, depending on what you can do. So it's a tactic that can like draw a lot of support to a family to keep people in their homes, and that has like a lot of values and benefits. And you can sort of build leadership through doing it. You can help people feel power to stay in their homes and create community. So it can be really transformative, and you can create sustained organization around an eviction blockade or eviction defense that lasts beyond that sort of like moment of intervention. I also think that stuff can be really, really hard to scale if you don't have a really robust volunteer infrastructure. And that's what really starts to lack in organizations that end up relying on service models to drive their organizing or right to counsel to drive their organizing. People end up sort of relying on the professionals who are going to do like the service work, and then forget about all of the organizing that's required to maintain that service delivery as at all effective at all. So that's sort of just like one thing about eviction defense. It's so critical to keep people in their homes. And there's many different types and styles of interventions that you need. The other thing that we are experiencing here is that right to counsel starts to break down when the eviction courts get overwhelmed. And the first thing that the court has decided to do is just say that they're basically just not enforcing right to counsel. They're like, okay, well, we made a good effort to get tenants attorneys and we didn't do that. And now we're just going to let the case move forward anyway. So our right to counsel in New York is in total crisis. And organizers are doing a lot of very cool work, interrupting housing courts, going in and sort of just like they're doing very cool speak outs in the calls of housing courts about what your rights are to an attorney. A tenant has a right, for example, a tenant has a right in New York to say that they want a right to counsel attorney, and then the case will maybe stop moving forward if the tenants sort of affirmatively are asking for their right to an attorney and they can go and they can get one. But you have to ask for it. If you're not, and they're not, you have to ask for it. And if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. So there's all sorts of like ways in which the state is trying to prevent right to counsel from being implemented in the way that it needs to be implemented.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if you hear my cat meowing, but he's desperately trying to get into this room right now. It's kind of a whole thing. The tension between organizing around the emergency needs of tenants, right, and longer term efforts is a very real one, and it's a long-standing problem. I can't remember how many conversations we've had, basically. And I think, Tracy, you and I have been in some of the same rooms, in fact, when we've talked about this problem, that there is a reality, right? That the people who come to us, by and large, are coming to us in crisis. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, but it is a thing that does create a sort of path dependency, right? In terms of the organizing that we do, where we're always trying to respond to people's specific efforts or problems, and we're not necessarily always focused, eyes on the prize with the kind of longer term organizing. And of course, the problem, I think part of it is in conceptualizing what we mean by an eviction to begin with, right? If we were to talk about the legal process of an eviction alone, then that has to take, I think, in a lot of ways, precedent, right? To respond to the threat of a sheriff coming and banging on someone's door and dragging them out of their homes, right? That is a very real thing. But there are other types of bad landlord behavior that to me is just part and parcel of the same process, right? Whether it's bad conditions where the landlord is very deliberately milking the property, or they are trying to stop investment in a property so that the tenants will move out. That is a very common strategy. Whether it be slapping particular or bizarre fees, whether it is changing the rules or dynamics in the building, right? So the tenants can no longer, for example, have their kids playing outside after 9 p.m. or that they turn off the lights in the buildings after a certain hour. There are all types of activities that landlords engage in to try to make the life of a tenant much harder, right? In a building. The goal being, of course, that the tenant is going to quote unquote self-evict. It's a term I hate. It's a term of art that really just describes a landlord making a tenant's life hell so that they move out. And then, of course, there's just other forms of kind of petty and frankly, sometimes very violent forms of harassment that landlords engage in to try to get people out. And so that creates a situation where the organizing efforts can oftentimes seem or be ephemeral. And of course, structural problems I mentioned the lack of a Wagner Act, right, makes it so that the moment that individual emergency effort collapses, there is very little to pick up the pieces after the fact, right? That is a very real problem. And of course, we're never going to be able to move away from kind of emergency response from eviction defense. It's never going to go away as long as, landlordism is profitable. And as long as landlords are coming up with ever more sophisticated strategies to prevent their tenants from being able to get defended efficiently. Right now in LA and actually throughout the state, one thing we've been seeing through the Tenant Power Toolkit is that landlords are oftentimes not serving their tenants their eviction paperwork, so that tenants then end up losing their cases automatically. They get default judgments from the court, and the tenant suddenly realizes that they are getting evicted only because they have a sheriff's notice at the door. That is not by accident, right? We know that this is happening, or increasingly so, because tenants, or rather landlords, recognize that tenants have an opportunity to respond to their evictions a bit faster. It is landlords responding to the work of tenant organizers that is leading to a shift in how people have to respond. What is the response to that? To me, there is only one sort of long-term project or response to that organizing problem, which is to build community, right? Tracy said this word a couple of times. That means treating the organizing effort as organizing tenants as a whole, right? Organizing tenants and the issues that tenants bring to us, whether that be things like ICE potentially coming to their homes, whether it be trying to get food parcels, whether it comes to applying for public benefits, whatever the tenant comes to us in crisis with that is not to do with their housing, we can intervene there to ensure that the tenant feels that their tenant union, that the tenant organizing has value outside of just preventing them from receiving an unlawful detainer from the court.
It could be DCYF issues. Child welfare issues have come up with us.
That's absolutely right. No, Dan, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because actually that has happened where we have often tried to help tenants, mothers, single mothers in particular, who are at risk of losing their children. Anyone who's done homelessness organizing, I've done this, about 9 years ago, we had a situation like that with a college professor, an adjunct professor, who literally was living on the streets with his wife and their children, and we had to intervene to prevent them from losing their kids. So no, that's exactly right. But it also means, though, building kind of, institutions or organizing efforts based around joy, based around culture, based around, feeding people. It has to mean throwing block parties like we've done in the LA Tenants Union. The East Side Local, Unión de Vecinos, have done this a number of times. In the Northeast Local, we've done this. In my previous organizing efforts on Skid Row, we would do this on 6th and Gladys. We would have block parties for the for unhoused tenants. It really does mean building communities of joy so that it isn't just the grim prospect of losing your house that drives you to be a neighbor, a proper neighbor to your neighbors. So many of the tenants who come to us in the LA Tenants Union have told me in very different organizing campaigns, they have said this to me very clearly oftentimes, that it was the organizing what taught them how to be a better neighbor, how to be a neighbor to begin with to other folks. That to me is about building a culture of organizing based around building community, and not just, as Sia has said, right? Not just providing a service that allows people to check in and out whenever they need it. If we're ever going to actually build, something towards a tenant revolution and the ability of tenants to be able to determine the course of their own lives, it's going to have to begin by getting people to believe in the power that they can bring, right? By talking to their neighbors and building community with their neighbors.
Tracy?
Yeah, I guess just to, sort of summarize and extend, this idea of like, what is an eviction? Eviction by harassment, by neglect, by construction noise, by surveillance, by, of course, rent increases, right? Because rent increases are a legal form of eviction that will effectively evict someone from their home, but are completely normalized under our legal system, right? And eviction is both a court process, but it's also a policing process, right? The sheriff is the person who ultimately will come to your home and kick you out. And so I think, we often say, to build on what you said, Renee, like we often say, like staying in your home is the most important thing that you can do if you're at risk of eviction. And because that power of occupying your unit, and we, saw a lot of that power restored through the pandemic, where the union was doing an incredible amount of illegal lockout support. And that is really like, when I think of this question, I think of the fact that like our logo in the union is about to change from a key to a bolt cutter, right? And it's because of the work that we've done to occupy our homes. And I think about extending that sense of occupation to like, what is it that we're doing in buildings when we're on rent strike? We're staging an occupation. We're controlling the space of our homes. We're claiming housing as a right without the need to pay for it, even if it's temporary. And then extending this idea of occupation to our neighborhoods, to controlling the territories of our blocks, and to producing community. Like one of the core strategies for Latu is building relationships as security. And the effort that we put in to occupying space, to producing that community, is really the security that we need to defend ourselves and defend each other.
What in your various campaigns has winning looked like? I know that sometimes it can be complicated in base building. It's not, when base building is the focus, there's not obviously such a direct answer. But for me, it's a critical question because concrete wins are what the tenants we're organizing in Rhode Island are counting on from getting involved with our organization. And I'd say that our short-term goal winning looks like getting repairs done, stopping evictions, things of that nature. But long-term, our goal is to force a sale of this entire portfolio to nonprofits, which have their own problem, but is, I think, our best case scenario at the moment. Nonprofits who will permanently maintain the units in good condition and affordability, because this is an atrocious slumlord that will never be an okay landlord, like, period. It's not his business model. What does winning look like for you all?
I think winning is a process. So winning feels like a dynamic and engaged tenant union that is continually meeting and growing. Winning is like a really powerful tenant assembly, and how like tired and good you feel at the end of that, and how the sort of like sense of belonging that people have after going through a meeting and like not wanting it to end because people are excited about the work that they're doing together. In addition to that, some of the things that I'm proud of that we've been able to win together through organizing tenants in New York State are, reforms that foment organizing, like strengthening and expanding our state's rent control system. We're incredibly proud of that. Some of the ways in which we've been able to recruit tenant leaders out of our movement and run them for office without taking real estate money and win. Those are some examples of like tenants sort of exerting political power, both in their building and in their community. And, I think we are likewise grappling with what it means for tenants to sort of take over ownership of their building. We don't super have time to get into it here, but you could do a whole other podcast about what the role of not-for-profit and community, like co-op, limited equity co-ops are in like taking control of real estate and land. I think that we've experienced a lot of limitations. We've experienced a lot of limitations of like the shared equity or limited equity cooperative model of ownership here in New York, but also people want control over their homes. And so anything from like inking an agreement with the landlord or winning those repairs and winning them permanently, or taking it and turning it into real political power, either in the legislature or at the electoral level, is what winning feels like.
I mean, I can just jump in and say this is a hard question, but I mean, I think winning really does mean keeping people in their homes first and foremost, right? Ensuring that they're gonna stay there. So often, I have to say, on that very basic sort of in that kind of a campaigner tactic, that winning is actually more common than we realize, right? There are so many tenants that I've been able to intervene in to assist them in forming a tenants association, in pushing back initially against landlord harassment, that has resulted in people being able to stay in their homes. And that is a victory in itself, even if it oftentimes doesn't look like a big splashy victory at that, right? That is something that I think we should recognize, that it can often feel, winning can oftentimes feel unsexy, and that's okay. I will say, though, that winning also means finding some silver linings even in losses, right? In very bitter losses. Some years ago, my partner led a year-long rent strike in South Central Los Angeles with the Expo tenants, where unfortunately those tenants were pushed out. And one of the final things that he and his partner organizers put together was a big, beautiful community block party, basically, for the tenants. And from that effort, first off, it was just a beautiful kind of social event in and of itself, this kind of celebration of the fight. From that event, though, they were able to ultimately, build something of a core of cadre, right, of organizers who today are leading some of the most exciting sort of fights in the LA Tenants Union, from what was, we have to be very honest, an immediate or a short-term kind of loss, right? It means being able to build for the future, right? In the way that I think Sia and Dan, you have also covered in a different way. I also think, though, and this is kind of very relevant for, I think, on a personal level, but also in the organizations that I'm in, that, I've oftentimes straddled both the kind of the policy world and the kind of on the ground worm's eye level organizing. And what I've been able to experience and notice and very, I think, happily kind of recognize is that the radical organizing that we do on the ground changes the dynamic, it changes the narrative, it changes the conditions that allow for reforms that are never going to be enough on their own, but definitely change the conversation and the possibility that tenants have to be able to stay in their homes. So even in the very grim sort of loss that we had in LA, where our tenant protections were just lifted, there are new tenant protections that have started to kick in the city of LA that are, a bit of a game changer. They are something that we should recognize as being reforms that, tenants in other places would kill to have, right? That was made possible from that radical organizing. And it was made possible, frankly, by never accepting that these reforms are enough. No one in the Los Angeles Tenants Union, no one in the Debt Collective, no one in any tenant organization thinks that any of this is enough. And that is precisely the kind of mentality, that kind of that desire, right, to always build on even these kind of smaller victories that allows us to be able to build for something more.
I am always really wary of the kind claiming as a win the kind of electoral processes that end up with us stepping in to manage the scarcity of the state, as my mentor Don Ryan would say, or as to step in to negotiate the terms of our defeat, as my mentor Leonardo Vilches would say. And that's not to say that this, the state is like a host of capacities and resources. That's not to say that they're impossible to leverage, but I think that we have to maintain a kind of strategy about what the role of our movement is in that. Is it to govern, or is it to produce a crisis of legitimacy and capacity for the state? And, to me, winning is the abolition of the present state of things, right? Winning is the abolition of rent. But in the meantime, right, winning is institution building. It's the kind of pedagogical process that means that we're growing a consciousness around, to quote James Boggs, rights are what you make and what you take. That we're putting the tactics of taking those rights and making those rights in the hands of more and more people, and that we're building a culture that is, for lack of a better way of putting it, like a church that has the potential to keep the faith for people, to participate over the course of what will be a really long struggle.
Shanti.
Yeah, I guess I think, everyone I think covered it really well, but I think about this too, as a I'm a policy director, but I'm a policy director for an organizing formation. So, when I have to analyze what, sort of policy reforms that I think might understandably feel incremental compared to our broader goal that Tracy just outlined so well. When I think about what they actually do, or, when I think about the time that we're spending as a movement organizing for different policies, or different at the local level, whether it's rent control or just cause, whether it's right to organize, whether it's right to counsel, et cetera. Is it winning is building infrastructure, even if you nominally lose? Is it opening up a more radical horizon? Is it building the base to win more in the future? I really just think about it as infrastructure more than anything.
Lastly, and there are a lot of questions I wanted to ask and we didn't have time to answer, but this has been an amazing discussion. Lastly, what role does supply play in this all, specifically in terms of expanding the public or social housing stock? Because in Rhode Island, we've made the establishment of a public developer a top priority, specifically because we see it as something that would, generally expand public services for the public good on a general level, but concretely because it would, one, create a public option in the housing market that would increase tenant leverage vis-a-vis landlords, very concretely for pioneer tenants, and then more generally allow us to make a demand directly on the state to address the housing crisis through housing production in a way that's not currently possible. Sia?
So on the question of housing supply, Two things. One, I really like the idea of having a public developer that can do expropriation. I think we've all experienced as tenant organizers the idea that we want to work together with tenant associations and we want to take over housing, but the community land trust model or the not-for-profit developer model or the limited equity cooperative model, all of those are like really lacking and are not challenging real estate capital the way that we want to. And so the idea of a public developer that has the capacity to like really do expropriation and to be sort of an option for tenant public stewardship and tenant ownership is really attractive. I also think that one of the reasons why we talk about a need for a public developer and the need for public housing that can serve a broader part of the population than public housing currently serves is because we talk about sort of like the political constituency that is necessary to maintain a public housing system. That political constituency can only like exist and be created through tenant organizing. It doesn't get created by policy and the creation of like a public developer on its own. So I think that, we have to win social housing and create new model public housing and build new model public housing, not just expropriation, but we also have to build. But we can't let that movement get ahead of the tenant power building movement. Because ultimately, if you're building new public housing, but it's in this state and this sort of like capitalist state that is more interested in policing us than it is in like providing high quality housing, that's not going to end up as a very good option. So we need to have that sort of countervailing force of tenant organizing that is capable of making the public housing that we're going to one day build or whatever be at all successful. So I really don't think that you can do one without the other. Another sort of thing that I just would like add to this debate is that we worked really hard to get our state to expropriate vacant hotels during the pandemic and convert them to housing for homeless New Yorkers. We were actually able to pass a law that would require the state to do that, and the state refuses, right? Because they don't want to be a developer or a landlord. They're like so interested in leaving that part of the industry to the private sector. So I think there's really limits on what you can do with sort of social housing legislation and public housing legislation in a moment with this state generally, and also with this state specifically, in New York State specifically. The state is not going to challenge the real estate industry. They don't really want to. And even if we're like, we want you to own, we want you to be a landlord, they're like, no, please don't make us. And so we are not going to be able to control that until we have built the tenant power. And we don't need to wait to do the public developer until we have done that. But we need to be really strongly committed to doing both at the same time. And we can't let one happen first.
Perhaps even dialectically.
Yeah.
Shanti.
Our housing system under the capitalist state, I'm going to sound a little bit like an econ nerd for a second, but it responds to investment demand, right? Globally, but also locally. It doesn't respond to the actual demand for occupation of housing that people have. And I think that's really important when we're talking about the broad concept of supply, that if you look at the demand, our system of supply is responding to the occupation or the demand for investment, not the demand for shelter. And, our choices in this current system to either restrict housing supply or build housing supply, through the market, they're both tied up in the fundamental interest of real estate capital to maintain housing as a continuously appreciating asset, right? They're not, I think I don't really think about it as a binary when we think about, artificial restrictions on market supply versus, the push to remove them under any circumstance. And as far as, the fight for social housing is concerned, just Sia touched on this, but politically, you're not going to win social housing or public housing or even, the sort of general concept that people throw around of quote unquote abundant housing. You're not going to get the capitalist state to invest in existing housing or new housing without organizing the political constituency that needs to live in it and that needs to defend it in the long term. And that's tenants. Like you're not going to solve the housing question or the, supply question or whatever you want to call it without organizing tenants. There is no way around that.
Tracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to like bring up this idea, right? That like, what does it mean to add to supply, not just by building buildings, but by building power and building power to expropriate and use eminent domain? And these are capacities of the state that we can leverage, and that are, you know, part of what is coming out of the struggle of tenants right now. Like if we look at what tenants in Hillside Via are doing in the context of quote unquote affordable housing, if we look at what tenants on Flower Drive and Second Street are organizing in the context of living in rent controlled housing, if we look at the unhoused residents of the Grand Hotel who are in Project Roomkey, the demands, there is a common demand, and that is for the state to use its power of eminent domain to remove these properties from the private market and to ensure that tenants have long-term stability and dignity in their and control over their living situations. So I know that we're like often stuck talking to technocrats about like people's backyards, right? But like this is the kind of housing that people are demanding for themselves. They're demanding control over their housing. And I do think that it's really important. Like I think about Inez from Flower Drive, who, you know, she gave an amazing speech at the end of the Atun convention. And what she said was, you know, I used to think of communism as being controlled, but now I understand it. I understand it as community control. And this is the knowledge that is being produced through struggle on the ground, that the thing that people want as in the tenant movement as tenants, where you don't control your housing, is community control. And so for me, it's really thinking about how, like, the question of supply, like, I think we can answer the question of the supply by answering the question of how can we leverage the capacity of the state to expand community control over the places where we live.
Renee.
Yeah, I would very much agree with. Yeah, no, I'd very much agree with everything that both Shanti and Tracy have kind of outlined, and to put like maybe, or to comment around the edges, you know, I think that, you know, as Shanti very eloquently put it, right, the real estate market, the real estate industry is going to respond to the signals, right, broader economic sort of signals and imperatives that have very little to do with what people actually need and have everything to do with whether or not they're going to be able to command a return on their investment worth their while, right? And of course, on the question of supply, we always have to also consider the cost of capital itself to begin with as kind of a very determining factor. I think the question of supply always elides, or it doesn't entirely account for the fact that people need housing as a thing that we need to live in first and foremost, and oftentimes treat it as though it is just something that, you know, with the right sort of financing mechanism, we're going to be able to get the thing that we need. It's why, as you know, others have already stated, we cannot solve this issue alone by having that one neat trick or that one nice policy solution that's going to be able to provide it, because ultimately, as others have also already said, that the real estate industry isn't necessarily itching to build the housing that we require, that the communities require to be able to produce housing that is affordable, that is clean, that is safe, that is healthy for folks to live in. That is also, I should say, housing that is also able to create the conditions for a deepening of community. So creating housing with sufficient community space, places where people can live together, properly speaking, can educate their kids together, can grow as individuals and as families. The industry is not necessarily itching to do that. And so the kind of stuff that we're actually wanting to do, right? The stuff that we really want to do is a transformative sort of program for tenant power and tenant control. Right? It means being able to build a radically different sort of housing system than the one we have today. And so I guess to me, the question of supply is important, but also incidental to that broader point, which is that what we're actually seeking to do is to upend the real estate state, if you will, entirely, right, from the ground up. What we need to do is to move from a system that treats housing as a speculative asset, one that people use on a day-to-day, on their day-to-day lives to be able to reproduce themselves, to live a joyful and happy life, right? That is ultimately the world that we're seeking to build. Social housing is a term that has increasingly become, sexy over the last couple of years. And the lefty in me, who has also lived in, former social housing, I couldn't be happier about that. I couldn't be happier about the fact that we're finally starting to talk about a world in which housing is treated differently, right? A world in which, as Shanti said, being obsessed with building, ever kind of larger returns for property or landowners isn't the thing that we're attempting to do, but rather we are trying to ensure that everyone's safely housed with dignity, etc. I think that is important and good. I do also want to ensure that we understand the implications of what that means, right? And so as Tracy has talked about expropriation, it means that we have to move towards a world where the common weal is the primary thing that we obsess over or that we want to achieve. And we do that by ensuring that more and more property is being taken off that speculative market to begin with. It means then, again, building both the housing that doesn't yet exist, but also ensuring that where people are happy and have community and have decent living already, that they get to be able to stay there. Ultimately, for me, what all of this amounts to is people should be able to determine, they can't always determine where they come from, but people should have the right to determine where they will be, right? They should be able to determine where they will end. And I think that, to me, is the fundamental question of human dignity. And to me, the question of social housing and the question of building tenant power ultimately comes down to that people should have an ability and a right to be able to stay where they will be.
Shanti Singh, Tracy Rosenthal, Renee Moya, and Sia Weaver, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
That was my interview with Shanti Singh, Tracy Rosenthal, Renee Moya, and Sia Weaver. If you want to help out, please give generously to the Pioneer Tenant Support Fund. The link to donate is in the show notes. Shanti Singh is the Legislative and Communications Director at Tenants Together, a California coalition of over 50 tenant unions and housing justice organizations. Tracy Rosenthal is a writer and co-founder of the LA Tenants Union, whose book, Abolish Rent, is forthcoming from Verso. Renee Christian Moya is the Tenant Power Coordinator with the Debt Collective and an organizer with the Los Angeles Tenants Union. Sia Weaver is the coordinator of Housing Justice for All, a statewide coalition of grassroots organizations fighting to build tenant power and end homelessness in New York State. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, in present-day society, the instruments of labor are the monopoly of the landlords. The monopoly of property and land is even the basis of the monopoly of capital and the capitalists. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. We are recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us at The Dig Radio on Twitter and find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes, please also rate and review us. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling other people about the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.